Begin the current Daf, Mesechtas Beitzah Daf Chav. Begin 7 lines down at the top of the Yomim. But the Gemara continues to explain the halacha of our previous Mishnah. We had brought that there was 3 things Rabbi was machmir like Beishamai. The first thing was regarding that you don't do hatamana. You don't insulate initially hot things from Yom Tiv to Shabbos. And that the Gemara was discussing Maman Shach. If you made an Erev Tavshil, and everyone should agree yes. If you didn't make an Erev Tavshil, everyone should agree not. And that the Gemara gave one interpretation regarding what's this halacha that specifically Beishamai held was awesome, Basila hold is mutter. And then the Gemara is going to give another interpretation now to what the machlekes is between Beishamai and Basila. That you really did like Beishamai did not do atmana from Yom Tiv to Shabbos. Shiur corresponds to Kazich and Cheskel turns and Daf Acham B'Shem joining us for today's Daf. Something we're going to discuss in today's Daf are we're going to explain the 3 items that Gamliel ruled like Beishamai, which relates to the halachas of Machshir Eichel Nefesh. That if one can go ahead and do malacha, not for the food itself, but the preparatory elements of for the food items, using a non-Jew to provide medicines and cures on Shabbos, although refuah would be forbidden, but with a mila akum that would be permitted. And then the next Mishnah brings 3 items in which Ramlil actually adopted a lenient approach on Yom Tiv. Several laws related to scents, incense, perfume, and what's called moilid reich on Yom Tiv, and in which case it is permissible where it gives that smell into an item, thus causing a change in that item. Some of the halacha terms and discussions we're going to bring up today are binyan, steer, bekalim, which is 2 lamates malachas are binyan, building, and steer is demolishing. Machlekes b'sham itself that applies to kalim, to movable items too. Lechem apanim are the showbreads that were brought every week on Shabbos in the Beitzah Mikdash on the shulchan, and then have a certain measurement, which the Gemara is going to introduce parenthetically. Refuah b'Shabbos v'Yom Tiv is that there was exerted rabbanan not to do any medicinal or therapeutic healing on Shabbos and Yom Tiv, because in Talmudic times they would have the herbs and they would grind it, and that's how they would make their medicine. And therefore, if we let you use the medicine, you might come to be Teich their Eisa. And again, although that's something that might not be applicable today, we still have the exerted rabbanan of refuah. So begin the current Daf, 7 lines down to the top of the oven. First, we finished the first of the 3 interpretations of the first of the 3 halachas that we mentioned in our previous Mishnah. We had mentioned that Ramlil is machmir like Beishamai in 3 things. First thing we said was Ein Toimnes Acham Leketchila BeYom Tiv. You don't do atmana initially on Yom Tiv to Shabbos, which again, like we said, the Gemara was asking, well, why would it be permitted or forbidden? It should depend on the Erev Tavshil. So on that, the Gemara had said the first interpretation was that really you didn't make an Erev Tavshil, and that's why Beishamai holds it's forbidden. So why would they say it's permitted? Because of this halacha of Rav Huna that what's called Kedei Chayev, enough that you need to survive, even if you didn't make an Erev Tavshil, Beit Hill allows you to cook from Yom Tov to Shabbos. Now Rav Amma gives a second interpretation. It says, the truth is that we're talking about that you did put an Erev Tavshil. So now the difficulty is, according to Beishamai, why can't you go ahead and do atmana from Yom Tov to Shabbos? That's the point of the Erev. It says the Gemara, but insulating is different. Why? It's evident, it's obvious that the Shabbat covered. Why you do it? Insulating is not for now. You're covering it over with things to keep it for a later point in time. It's obvious you're doing it cooking or baking. It's not so obvious. So Meda'ayev is so good. We let you cook right now, even though really intention for Shabbos. But that's money that you're doing it for. It's obvious doing it for the Shabbos. That's already going to be forbidden according to Beishamai, even with an Erev. Problem is, Abaya asks on this interpretation of Rav in the following price. Hananya Omer says, Beishamai Omer, the school is Shama, they say, Ein Oifen, not allowed to bake on Yom Tiv for Shabbos, Elam Ken Erev Bepas, unless specifically you made a special Erev with bread. Vema Vash, now cook from Yom Tiv to Shabbos, Elam Ken Erev Betas, unless you specifically made an Erev with a cooked dish. And then in time you now do insulating, Elam Ken Hoy Lecham Timun Me'er Yom Tiv, unless you had a hot things that are already insulated from before Yom Tiv. But the inference is, if you did have warm things insulated, then that you are allowed to do atmana, even though it's obvious that you're doing it for Shabbos, and this is Hanani actually the more stringent interpretation in Beishamai, because all you have to do is special air for every single types of food item. And you see that you could do atmana if you did an air. So how can you say that it's talking about when you did one and Beishamai holds that atmana is mucha milsa? So Elam Abai disagrees with Rav and he gives a different interpretation. He says, to the contrary, it actually is this chananya that he asked from. It's talking about you baked and you cooked from before Yom Tiv for the purpose of an Erev, but you didn't make an Erev of the type of insulating warm things. It's Chanani according to Beis Shammai, which says yes, you cannot do atmana from Yom Tov to Shabbos because you didn't make a special event. Beis Hillel holds it's mutter because Beis Hillel holds you don't have to make each and every type. So you don't have to make one thing, and it'll be enough. That is the other interpretation in this first machlokes of these three cases where Mil was machmir like Beis Shammai. Now we go on to the second of the three cases that Mil was machmir like Beis Shammai, as we said in the Mishnah. You're not allowed to stand up a candelabra that fell down. Now the Gemara says, "My couple, what are you doing? What isser is involved? What would be the problem about picking up the menorah?" So Rav Chinna Bar Bismillah says, we're talking about specifically the menorah shechil skin. We're talking about a menorah that's made up of different parts. When it falls, the parts become separated. Oh, the Kabani, when you're putting it back up, when you're putting the pieces back together again, it looks like you're building. Now, what's the machlokes Beis Shammai held? Because the Beis Shammai Sabri Yesh bin Bikelim. Beis Shammai holds that there is a halachic problem about baina, building in a vessel, and even though it's not attached to the ground, and baina is chayiv, even the minute amount. So when you put pieces together and it looks like building, that could be a problem because by kelim there actually is a problem about building. The Sulsab, Beis Hillel holds no ain bin Bikelim, there's no problem of building or demolishing by kelim. And as Rashi points out, you would only be chayiv if you did a malacha. For example, if you were smoothing out, or if you were cutting to a certain measurement, or you were weaving, or you were stitching and sewing, which those are their own types of malachas. But just putting the pieces back together again, the only problem would be buying that. There's no buying that only by a house or by an oil, and therefore that's the machlokes Beis Shammai Hillel. And Rabbi Gamliel was machmer like the school of Shammai, not to be machzer the chulyos, to put the menorah back together again, because of the halacha of Beis Shammai that there is a problem about bin nestira bekelim. Now, the Gemara continues a related discussion that Ula ikla be Rabbi Yehuda. Ula went to the house of Rabbi Yehuda. Then Kam Shammai, the attendant of Ula got up and zokef lo the shraga. Really, it's a very different halacha than what we mentioned before, but it's similar in the sense of we're talking about straightening up a candelabra. But what as Rashi explains, really what he was doing, this attendant, was that he wanted that the oil should flow backwards, that it shouldn't be drawn after the wick, and then it's going to be extinguished, because obviously that's how it lights when the oil is close to, it is able to draw the oil. He wanted to pull it away, that it's going to stop drawing from the oil, and then the candle will go out. So Rabbi Yehuda, whose house he came to, he asked Ula from the following Beitzah. Beitzah says, someone puts an oil into a lamp on Shabbos, although he's not lighting a fire, he's liable for havara, for igniting, because by adding the oil, it's causing it to burn. If someone utilizes that oil, let's say he wants to eat some with his mitzvah, wants to put in some oil, whatever it is, he takes some of the oil, he's liable for extinguishing. And as Rashi says, extinguishing on Yom Tov is not permitted, which, as Taisa points out, is not because you're causing it to extinguish quicker, because that would be Garam Kibbutz, and Garam Kibbutz on Yom Tov actually is permitted, even if you cause it to go out quicker, and even Shabbos is not really chayav. Taisa says rather the reason is because since at that time that you're using it, you're actually extinguishing a little bit, and you're diminishing the light, you can't have so much benefit from it, so therefore, that's Nira Kibbutz, and therefore that would be a problem about Mechaber. But one thing is, he said, how do your attendant do this? You're pulling back the oil, it's a problem about Kibbutz. So Malay said to him, he says, you're right, I didn't go ahead and notice that what he was doing, and you're right, that would not be permitted because there would be a problem about kibbutz on Yom Tov. Now, continuing this halacha of a lamp, about a candle, Somer Rabbi says, kanva, which Rashi, the way he explains it, has a different interpretation, is that they would pull the top of the wick because it became a little bit like charcoaly, and by pulling it, you help it light a little bit better. That shari, that's permitted to be done, and that's not any problem of on Yom Tov. Now the Gemara.
More oil, maybe.
What?
You're using up more oil.
You're using up more oil.
When you pull it up, the fire gets bigger.
Nobody's trimming it. It's trimming the wood.
It's burning the top of the wick.
Not sure what happens when he does that. What would be the svar to be usher? Yeah. So limchid resha basila. He pulls out the top of the wick and he makes it. What's the issur? What do they say? What would be the problem? Why would you think it's asur? What's the asur mutter over here? This is kind of short. To smooth it out. I mean, I think it helps to illuminate a little bit better. But they said that still that's going to be permitted to be done. I mean, that's it's on Yom Tov, because Yom Tov you're allowed to do to cause it to light something better. So the Gemara says, related, the Gemara says, he says, it says, what's the halacha? Can you extinguish a lamp for, it's a euphemism for something else, which means to say, what?
It says that it's going to improve it when he needs to relight it. This is at the end. The calf and noicher actually have the closer. So maybe it's masakin.
Right, this is a tuchituya, right? Right, because there's another one that's also right. So this is that's why it's over here. Right, it would be different when you're lighting. Because why would that one? Because you're going to be putting out a little bit when you do that?
Why? Because you're fixing it. So fixing it.
Reason why he says that there's two, right? Because the Tais says below Nehira. You come on, Perkam maybe call it Meichten and it calls it something else. I Meichten and do Chashecha, but come on, Hachikani Lishna, Lawsome. Karne the Checha tu Yesh. Echam Shosha Dailik. That sounds like he's saying something else. One is when you're lighting, after it was extinguished, there's a light better, quicker. He allowed to go ahead and do that so that when you're going to light it, it's going to light better. Right. Well, he says lighting the hero on Rashi. Right. Right. So the question is, what's Rashi saying? Either as a name, meaning it sounds like that even though you're taking off that thing, that's not a problem. That's considered as havar, which you're allowed to do on Yom Tov, and there wouldn't be a problem about machab because machab you're not allowed to do on Yom Tov. And that's what you say. Like if someone has food to cook, you know what I'm saying? You make another fire, maybe it's better than even put down the fire because havar we left, not kibbutz. But nothing about as mal lichbis is a nebnei davach. What's halacha? Can you extinguish a fire for something else, but let's say for marital, which Rashi explained, means for marital intimacy, which one is not supposed to have in front of a candle. Someone said to him, you could do it in another house, but you don't have to do it over here. It says, what happens if that guy doesn't have another room to go into? It says, you can make a mechitza. Like Rashi says, you could just put up a curtain. It says, well, what happens if you can't? You have nothing to make a curtain with. It says, was always clean. You could make the Shabbos lamp. You could put a vessel over. You could take before the Shabbos lamp. That's what we did with our lamps. You took whatever, put a bucket over the lamp. It says only clean mai. If it doesn't have a clean, he says okay then also. Then it says if you don't have any of those options, it's going to be also to put out the candle for marital intimacy. And the reason for this is because it's such a nasa guf. It's not considered tzarich echol nefesh. So that's why it's going to be usher to put out the lamp for Tashmish Amita. What? Right, we don't let right. We don't let right exactly. It has to be only tzarich echol nefesh for that. So the Gemara says the Gemara says the following brayso. You don't extinguish a fiery wood to be concerned about it, just that he doesn't want it to get ruined, because like Rashi says, this kibbutz is not considered tzarich Yom Tov. Or Rashi says, I heard that it's considered seisam nas libnis mekayma, which is more a worse type of a stira. It's because you want to use it itself. But be that as an A, vim b'shlosh leis ashen, if he wants that the house, like there, that the house or the pot shouldn't get smoky, then mutter is going to be permitted. So obviously you see that l'tzarich Yom Tov, you're going to benefit to it. It's going to be permitted, which l'chayr that's the same thing as tashmish amid. It's not an actual tzarich echol nefesh. It's just some type of other pleasure. You can see it's permitted. Amalei says no. Here be Yehudi. You're right. That should be Yehudi, which Gemara is going to bring later on the Chav base. That he says even machshira echol nefesh are permitted. Not only echol nefesh, not only the food itself, even the preparatory things for the food are permitted. Because he darshans and it says ya'asu lachem. Lachem means l'chol tzarchechem, for all your needs, including even machshira echol nefesh. And this is also considered a tzarich that you need. And so too regarding marital intimacy. And yeah, he would hold that it's going to be permitted to put out the candle. No, it says, when did I say this can be us? Is l'rabbanon, that they darshan no levadoi. Levadoi says no, only oichel nefesh, not tzarech oichel nefesh, and not any other pleasures like for marital intimacy or for the house not to be smoky. No, that you're not allowed to do. It has to be a direct oichel nefesh type of utility. Similarly, the Gemara brings another type of a discussion, the same idea. I asked from Rabbi, what's halacha? You're allowed to put out a fire on Yom Tov. So, the Gemara explains. When there's a danger to life, obviously I didn't have such a question. The Shabbos you're allowed to do that. When you have the question, even mum, which is just going to be a loss of money. What's halacha? Malay also says on Yom Tov, even on Yom Tov, you know, put out a fire if it's just loss of money. The Gemara says, the Gemara asks from the Beitzah we brought before. And the Beitzah said, you're not allowed to put out the log of wood, because if you don't want it to get ruined. But if you don't want the house or the pot to get smoked up, then what is going to be permitted? As Rashi points out, that there's no greater house getting smoked up than a fire, which obviously would be a tzarech Yom Tov to extinguish it, that he doesn't have to sit out in the hot sun or in the rain. So if you let it for just because you don't want a smoky house, you don't want it to be smoky, the fire alarm's going off and it's hard to breathe, for sure that means if your whole house goes up in flames, that for sure should be permitted. So how are you saying that it's asa? Says Gemara again, I hear Bihudi, that Bryce that says you're allowed to put out the log because you don't want it to smoke up the house is like a Yehuda, who holds all types of Yom Tov pleasures are permitted. When did I say that's asa? Feeling Rabbanon, they hold it has to be specifically oichel nefesh, which that's not the case over here, and therefore it's going to be forbidden to put out the log. Similarly, another type of discussion like this. What's halacha? Are you allowed to put some koil, which is some type of a ointment, some type of a makeup, on the eye for medicinal purposes on Yom Tov? So he explains, similar like we said in the previous discussion. When there's danger to life, where it makes some type of a discharge, where it's constantly crusting around the eye, or ditza, which is that it pierces like a needle, or dema, or there's blood that gathers over there, or dimasa, or it's constantly tearing, or kadachta, or like burning, and v'tchilas ochlo, and it's the beginning of this ailment of the eye. Let me boil it. That I don't have a question. I thought the Shabbos, even on Shabbos permitted, like the Gemara says in the Beitzah Daf Chavchas Mabeis, that Shirayna Da'ayna means to say that if the nerves of the eyes is buvnasa the libetol is actually connected to the heart, and therefore the cardiologist was going to tell you that it's going to be dangerous with the eye, even because that's connected to the heart, and therefore even on Shabbos you're allowed to go ahead and do that eye treatment. Kikim Bailey says my whole question is Saif Ochla, talking about where it's at the end of the illness, where it's very close to being healed, Ufatsuchiena, and he's only putting on this ointment to illuminate his eyesight and make it better. What's the halacha? Are you allowed to do that treatment on Yom Tov? Amalei Asa says refuah is aser on Shabbos and Yom Tov, and therefore you're not allowed to do that because there's no danger to life. Now, Esvei, again, he asked from this discussion, he also asked from the same Beitzah. Said, because you're not allowed to put out the log, etc., which you see that, but you're allowed to do it if you don't want the house to get smoked up. It's permitted for some other physical benefit that it shouldn't get smoked up. So for sure you should be able to go ahead and do malacha, that you can be able to see better. Why should it be any different than some type of physical benefit that then the house shouldn't be smoky? And he answered like we had answered before. Again, that Bryce is like a Yehuda who says lechemin lechol tzachechem. You could do any type of physical benefit, including marital intimacy. The house shouldn't be smoky, but we don't hold like that. He says we go like Rabbanan, who says it has to be specifically oichel nefesh, and therefore yes, you're not allowed to do it that the house shouldn't get smoky. You're not allowed to do it that if you want to be able to see better. You're not allowed to do it if it's for marital intimacy to extinguish the fire. Again, because we're going like the Rabbanan. Now, a related discussion regarding this about putting on this ointment, a meimer shori lemikla eina menacha b'Shabbat. So although we just pointed out that you're not allowed to put on this koil, this type of eye treatment on Yom Tov or Shabbos because of refuah, but it's permitted to be done through a non-Jew even on Shabbos, because all tzarchei chayla are permitted to be done through a nachri on Shabbos. Actually, those that say ameim agufik eina menacha b'Shabbat. Not only did he say it's permitted, he himself went and had this eye treatment done by a Nachi on Shabbos. What's your understanding that you let this be done by the guy? Because law is called all the needs of a sick person you're allowed to do it through a Gentile on Shabbos. And it says called anything that there's no danger to life, you're allowed to tell the Gentile, and he can do. But it says Rav Ashi says, wait a second. That's only where you're not helping with. You're helping with when he's doing the treatment for you, because the Ka'amitz of Pasach, you're opening and closing the eyelids so that the drops should go into your eyes. So you're participating in this. How are you allowed to do this? You're an accomplice to the crime. So Amalei said to him, you're right. Ikar Rav Zvid the Koy Kavasach. Rav Zvid, he was found the same difficulty as you. But Veshanile, I answered him, and I'm going to give you the same answer. Misayeya ein by mamish. Helping with has no substance. Meaning, if someone's not doing the actual malacha, he's just helping along a little bit, like here, where without himself it would be done. He's just helping by opening and closing the eyes. That has no significance. And that's what the Gemara says in Shabbos, it's like Gimel Medal, where if let's say two people together doing malacha, one guy can do it on his own, the other guy cannot do it on his own. So the one who could do it on his own, although the other guy's helping him along, the one who yachal is going to be chad, the ein yachal is going to be potter, even though he's sort of helping him. It's ein b'mam, no substance, because I don't really need you. I could have done it on my own. Here also, the fact that you're opening and closing your eyes is no significance because the guy could do it on his own, and therefore that's why it's not a problem that he's opening and closing his eyes too. Now, another related halacha, a meimer, shor l'mikcha ina b'yom tov she'ein is Rosh Hashanah. So, although we say that you're not allowed to do refuah, and this is actually one of the more well-known halachas, that Yom Tov Sheni is different than Yom Tov Rishon, although we generally treat Yom Tov Sheni same thing as Yom Tov Rishon, because you don't want people to be disgraceful and be mazalzel in Yom Tov Sheni, meaning in Goliath we have 2 days Yom Tov, but a meimer permitted to do refuah, to do the eye treatment on Yom Tov Sheni Rosh Hashanah, not only the first day, but not only the second day of Goliath, but even the second day of Rosh Hashanah. Says, wait a second, how can you say that? Rabbi said, if someone has someone who dies on the first day of Yom Tov, so he's asking about Mammon, so then the nations of the world, meaning Goyim, they should be involved in burying him, because you're not allowed to be doing malachas by Yisrael on Yom Tov. The Yom Tov Sheni, let's say he passed away on the second day of Yom Tov, so then he's asking about Yisrael, then a Jew could be involved in the dead person. Even on the 2 days of Yom Tov Rosh Hashanah, as a Getin Tamid Beis, because the significance of that is that Rosh Hashanah's 2 days is different than the 2 days of Goliath, as we pointed out in the past, because the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah was like Yom HaRichter. It's really like one long day, even there it's Yisrael, the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. It was made like one halacha of a Yom Tov, because it wasn't made out of suffix. In Goliath, the reason why we have 2 days Yom Tov, because they weren't sure when it was, but really there was only 1 day, but Maman Avshah, 1 is Chol, 1 is Yom Tov. In contrast to Rosh Hashanah, they made it even definitively. If an aid came after this man of Mincha, they said, okay, even though today's Rosh Hashanah, we're making tomorrow Rosh Hashanah, because they had a mistake with the shiur shel Yom. So that's a very important difference between that. So the problem that he's asking, he says, when we were lenient regarding the second day of Yom Tov, that was regarding a mess. But as the halacha continues on Tamid Beis, Masha'en came bebeya, regarding a beya shenoilin, an egg that was laid on the first day of Yom Tov. So although generally we're lenient, we say you could use the egg on the second day of Yom Tov in Manavshach, because if the first day was Yom Tov, not today's Chol. If the first day was Chol, so then there's no Nylon because it was born before Yom Tov and you're allowed to use it. But by the Rosh Hashanah, we say no. The Be'er Shenolda on first day of Rosh Hashanah is going to be us in the second day of Rosh Hashanah because it's considered one Kedusha. It's like 48 hours of the same Yom Tov. And they weren't lenient regarding the second day of Rosh Hashanah, only regarding mess. So what are you telling me that you're allowed to do refuah? Oh, it's Yom Tov Sheni, it's the second day of Yom Tov. We're not making on Rosh Hashanah, we're on the second day of Yom Tov. Maybe Yom Tov Shel Goliath, but not Rosh Hashanah. The only leniency we have is regarding a mess. So how do you tell me you're allowed to do refuah on the second day of Rosh Hashanah? So Shamalei says to him, no, I know Kanar Dois really. I hold it like the Nardians. Tell me that they say that we're not only lenient regarding Rosh Hashanah of mess, Af Bebeya. Yeah, as the Gemara brought on the Vav Medalef, even regarding an egg that was laid on the first day of Rosh Hashanah is permitted to say in Rosh Hashanah. You know why? Because they explain, they say, Umay Daitcha. what's your understanding that you want to be machmir on the second day of Rosh Hashanah? Because Dilma Ma'abri Leila El, maybe they're going to go ahead and make El not into 29 days, but into 30 days, meaning they're going to make what we would call 2 days Rosh Hashanah, which is really, every time we have 2 days Rosh Chodesh, where is that coming from? Because that's the 30th day, and then you have the next day. Here, you're going to tell me that they're going to make it a full El, which is where the whole Takana started from, to have 2 days Rosh Hashanah, even in Eretz Yisrael, because the guy's going to come, the witness are going to come after his Mincha, says, no. In the days of Ezra HaSefer and onwards, we never found that they made 30 days of El. So the whole reasoning doesn't really apply, because that never happened, never will happen, only happened once. Since the days of Ezra, it never happened, and therefore it's just like any other Yom Tov. That's only going to be 1 day Rosh Hashanah, and if we're going to have 2 days, it's going to be 1 day Chol, 1 day Yom Tov. Again, we treat it as 2 days, but really it's not Kedusha Achas. They don't hold to that Chumrah of saying Rosh Hashanah is different, and therefore it says that yeah, you could do Refuah on the second day Yom Tov, and even on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. Now, the third halacha that Ramilil was machmir like B'Shama was ve'enos v'pikin geritzim. You cannot bake the thick breads on Yom Tov. It has to be a thin wafer-like bread. Now, Targum the Beitzah elaborates on this halacha. B'Shama they say enos v'in pas ava b'Pesach. You don't bake thick bread on Pesach. Now, right now the Gemara assumes that you can't bake thick bread on Pesach, like the lafas, because there's a concern that you can't protect it from not fermenting, from becoming chametzik. That's why we have our matzahs are very thin, because machmir. Basil says no, you're allowed to bake the thick breads, obviously matzah breads, on Pesach. Now the question is, b'kama pas ava? How thick is this bread that Basil says you're allowed to bake these matzahs on Pesach? So Makloni says tefach. It's that of a hand breadth. And why did we get this idea from? Because we find by the lechem upon, by the showbreads which are brought every single Shabbos in the Beis Hamikdash, which it has to be matzah, it's unleavened bread, as the Gemara says in Menachos, Daf Nun Zayin Red Aleph. Now, how thick was the lechem upon? It was a tefach. It was a handbreadth, because, as Rashi points out, it was like its name was lechem apanim, the bread that had a face. Now, a face, as the Gemara says in Sukkot of Haman Aleph, is not less than a tefach. So that's how we knew that the lechem apanim was a tefach. Now, so you see that the lechem apanim was a tefach, and it was matzah. So you see that you could. How thick could you make bread that you could make sure it's not going to become chametzik? It's a tefach, a handbreadth, which is pretty thick type. But you have these lafa type of matzahs. That's going to be okay. However, the Gemara finds a difficulty with this comparison. Master Rabbi Yosef says, wait a second. Im amr b'zrizim. How are you learning out matzah that we would make from that they had in the Beitzah Daf? Because if they said with those who were diligent, meaning the family of Garmu, who they were craftsmen, they were very careful and they were very meticulous in the Beis Hamikdash making it, to make sure that even though it's very thick, it's not going to become chametz. Yomim B'Shein is reasoning to say regular people that they're not so diligent, it's not going to become chametz. How can we let up until tefach if we're not as reasoned as the Beis Garmu? And then if they said this regarding bread that was worked out, because the dough that was used for lechem panim had to have 300 times that it was rubbed with one's hands, and 500 times it was beaten with the fist. And so they would rub one time, beat it 2 times, they would rub it 2 times, beat it 3 times. The Gemara says another time. So this is really what's called worked out dough to make sure that it doesn't rise. You remember the Pasha and Mother, you're going to say without dough, no one does that. How can we make sure on Pesach that you can make it so thick it's not going to become chametzik? So to Mamar Beitzim Yivation, if they said that in the Beis Hamikdash they used very dry wood, because from Tu B'Av, one of the reasons why actually Tu B'Av is a Yom Tov, because they stopped cutting the wood for the paya, as the Gemara says in Tainis Tav Lamed Aleph, and the wood that they would have over there is what they baked, and they used all the things for the Beis Hamikdash. So it's very dry wood, and that's why they stopped at that point, which is with the height of the summer. When we use on Pesach, we're using moist wood. It's not as dry as that was. It's not going to beat it. It's not going to heat it as well to make sure that it doesn't ferment. And if they said this halacha of a tefach by a hot oven, because the Beis Hamikdash, they were heating up that oven every single day for menachas and for what they roasted. You remember B'Tana Tzana, I'm going to say for a cool oven like our ovens. And then remember B'Tana Shalatechas, and then they said regarding a metal oven, as the Gemara says that the oven in the Beis Hamikdash was made out of metal. And the reason is because the shtei alechem lecha apanim, when you would bake it, that was actually what was mekadosh. It was actually sanctified. You made it into the bread in the oven, so it was a klisharis. You can't make a klisharis out of cheres; it has to be out of metal. So therefore, it was made out of metal, the ovens, which obviously we know metal is a conductor; it heats up very much. Yomi b'tana shel cheres, most of the ovens in Talmudic times were made out of earthenware. Earthenware doesn't get as hot as metal. So basically, there's so many discrepancies between the Beitzah Mikdash and what we would do. Who said because the Beitzah Mikdash, the lechem was allowed to be up until a tefach and not become chametz? That would tell us that we regular people, when we make our breads on Pesach, then it can be up until a tefach and not become chametz. So the Gemara actually says a whole different interpretation. It's not talking about the halachas of chametz because of how thick it is, or it might become a machmetz or not. Amar Rav Yomi Ba'abi says, She'elis is Rebbe B'yichri. He says, I privately, between me and him, I asked my teacher, Uman, and who's his teacher, Rav. He says, my Pesach, what's this halacha, this brayso regarding machlokes b'sil b'sham, if you could bake this thick bread on Pesach? So he told me it doesn't mean thick. It means pas meruba. It means an abundant, a lot of bread. So it's not nothing to do with the halacha of chametz. It's about the halacha of tircha. Now, Iketami, those actually say that Rav himself was the one who asked his teacher privately, which Amar Rabbi Yimir Bar Abba Amar Rav. He says, Sheila says, Rabbi B'yichri says, I asked my teacher privately, who's that? Rabbeinu Kaddish, that was Rabbi Yudah Nasi, he was the teacher of Rav. And he asked him the same question, got the same answer. My pasuk, what does it mean you can't make thick bread and Basil holds you could? His pas meruba was an abundant amount of bread, which again, like we're saying, it's not because of chametz, it's because of you doing a tirchi yisera for tomorrow and the day after. What are you baking so much bread now on Yom Tov? Who's eating all this? And therefore you now do that on Yom Tov because you only can do what you need on Yom Tov. Now, if I might call it pasav, then why calling it thick bread if it's about an abundant, about a quantity? It says nefisha belisha because it's thick in the sense of that you're kneading a lot. Yeah, you're separating them into separate chalas and separate doughs, but that's why it's called pasav. Or another interpretation. In the place of this town, the pasav meruba, a large quantity, pasav currently they would call it thick because it was a lot. So again, those are two different interpretations why they call pasav, but it's not about what you thought it was about chametz. Is very simply because that of tirchi yisera. So the Gemara says, wait a second, let's see. Mishum dekutar tirchi d'lei tzaruchu. This whole machlekes b'sham is regarding are you doing an unnecessary exertion? So ma'ir Pesach. So why is this machlekes regarding Pesach? I feel b'sham Yom Tov nami. Even other Yom Tov also, like the halacha of our Mishnah, which is really where we got into this discussion from, where we said you can't make pitin gritzen, that because of the effort that's put into that. So why saying Pesach? So the Gemara you're right, it's not only Pesach. The Tana, the Yom Tov, the Pesach, right? That Tana haven't been discussing the laws of Pesach, but the truth is, it's nothing to do with Pesach. It's every Yom Tov. The Tana is similar in the Beitzah that all other Yom Tovim is the same machlokes. The Shammai in the school is Shammai. They say English and Pesach Yom Tov. You now bake a lot of bread on Yom Tov, but some material says it's permitted, and the reason why, which Rashi says, Tais disagrees, is because, like we had said previously in the Vidayim and Aleph, that bread bakes better when the oven is full with other breads. So although you don't need all those breads, but it's not considered that a tircha, unnecessary tircha for tomorrow and the day after. It's helping these breads bake better because it takes up the space of the oven, thus baking things better, and therefore Beisil disagrees with Beis Shammai. Now we're going to look at the next Mishnah, which, in contrast to the previous Mishnah, which we was machmer 3 things on Yom Tov like Beis Shammai, here it's the opposite. Afu Amar, so to he, Rabbi Shloimy said, 3 leniencies regarding the laws of Yom Tov. Number 1 is Machabdim Beis Hamitas. You're allowed to sweep the area of the couches, of the beds, where they would recline when they would eat over there, which basically the dining room that they had, they would recline on beds, that you're allowed to sweep that area on Yom Tov. Second of all was the Manichanes HaMugmer. You're allowed to put the frankincense on the coals, the Yom Tov on Yom Tov. And the third one was Va'isen Gedim Akulas. You're allowed to go ahead and make a kid goat that's with its entrails, which basically you have its intestines hanging on the outside when you're roasting it, which it's like makula is like armored. You're taking its intestines, putting it out, it looks like a guy with a bulky guy with all those weapons all around him. You're allowed to make the Balei Psachim on the night of Pesach, which they would do a Zeichel HaMikdash because the carbon Pesach had to be with all its intestines on it. And that's what they would do, even though there was no base of Mikdash. Chacham said, no, all 3 things are forbidden. Rashi explains why all 3 things are forbidden according to Rabbanan. Sweeping the dining room is a problem because of Shvui Gumas. You might come to smooth out, in some other times the floors are made out of earth, and you see that like one place is missing some earth, you might sweep in that and fill it up. which the other Tana held that's not a problem because it wouldn't get so dirty and you wouldn't have to sweep like that. Mugmar is forbidden because it's not a tzarech of kol nefesh. It's not every person, because that's what the Gemara says in Ksubit of Zayin Al. She'achol chol nefesh has to be something what's called davash shabel chol nefesh, and this of having this good smelling incense is only for someone that's a mafunik, someone that's a more of a delicate person, or someone that has a bad odor. But generally, not every single person needs this incense, and therefore that would not be permitted. And regarding the Gedim Kulis, regarding the kid goat with roasting like the Korban Pesach, is because it looks like kachim. And people are going to say, you let us sanctify and eat kachim b'chutz, like a Korban Pesach. People think he's eating the Korban Pesach, but you're not allowed to. So therefore, that's the machlekes. Chum say he's not allowed to, and Lil was leaning in these three halachas. So the Gemara explains regarding this halacha of mugmar. Amar Ravasi qualifies this machlekes. He says machlekes ligamer. Says the whole machlekes was when the chachams say that it's going to be forbidden is only if you're putting the coals on the incense on the coals to do mugmar. What's mugmar? Mugmar, like they would finish up the vessels by putting a pan with frankincense and coals on the fire, on the coals, and they put it beneath the garments, which would actually put a good smell into the clothing. So that's not considered hanas or guf. It's not a physical pleasure. It's just to prepare one's clothing. That's where they have the machlekes regarding are you allowed to put the incense on the coals. Avalor riach. But if you're putting the frankincense on the coals to have a good smell, everyone's going to agree that that's going to be permitted because that's considered a physical pleasure, and that's like a nefesh where you're coming into the dining room, good smell, and you sit down, and therefore that no one would disagree that it's going to be permitted. Which the Gemara actually asked Meitzri from the following brisa, which explains the halacha of our Mishnah. The brisa says, we said in the Mishnah, that the chacham hold Yinala sweep the dining room on Yom Tov. The house of Rabbi Lil, they said it's permitted to sweep. And Amr Rabbi Lezer Tzaddik, he says, Pa'am Harba, he says, many times Nechnaste Achar Abba LeBeis he says, many times I went after my father to the house of Rabbi Lil, it's not true. They didn't sweep the dining room on Yom Tov. You know what they did? They had a certain interesting concept. They would sweep the dining room from before Yom Tov. Then they put sheets over the floor. The next day, when guests would come in, which because they would be invited to the Suda of the Nasl, the covered Yom Tov, so then the Salkan said as a Sadina. Then they remove the sheets. Then comes out, voila, the house is cleaned up by itself because they just took away, they didn't sweep. They just took away the sheet. Amalek said to him, wait a second, if that was this grace thing that they did in Ramil's household, that can't be what they did there. And what's this grace? You're allowed to do the on Shabbos, you're not really doing anything. So too continues the Brisa, which we're going to come to in a moment to show where we're contradicting this teaching of Ravasi, which was regarding the second halacha of Mishnah. The Chacham say you can't put the incense on the coals in Yom Tov, but in the house of Gamliel, they did put it. Here too, Amar Blazer Tzaddik, he says the same thing. He says, no. Many times I went after my father to the house of Gamliel. They didn't put any incense on the coals on Yom Tov. Same shtick. What they did was, they brought these pipes of iron that had holes and were hollow. This is like the yeshiva buffer that they want to smoke. You put it into the bottle on before Yom Tov. They would smoke up the bottles before Yom Tov, and then they would close up the holes to keep the smoke and the smell that it shouldn't come out. Me'erev Yom Tov and before Yom Tov, and the next day when guests would come in, you open up the holes. Comes out that the house is getting the smoke by itself, which that's the patent. You could have the smoke and without lighting it, and it's there inside. Amalei said to him, if that's what they did, so then none of the colleagues would disagree with Leo, because Abba Shabbos Matlaskin, even Shabbos is allowed to do such a thing. Rather, it must be that they had put the incense on Yom Tov on the coals, and that's why they disagreed with him. Okay, but one thing the Gemara is showing, what we learned from this brisa is that when they were putting the incense on the coals, was not ligamer, wasn't for their clothing, for their suits, they wanted to have this good smell. It was actually to make a smell and it was for the honor of the guest, And that's what the Rabbana disagreeing and saying that no, you're not allowed to put it on Yom Tov according to the Talmud comment. And according to Rabbi Shloimy, even Lil didn't permit it. But you, Ravasi, you're saying that everyone holds it's going to be mutter. No, machlekes regarding legamer. But here you see the machlekes regarding lehariach. So the Gemara says you're right. Eli idmar. If we did say at hachi idmar, you're right. Amar Ravasi, his qualification was the other way around. Machlekes lehariach. Machlekes in our Mishnah was specifically regarding if you want to have a good smell. That's when Lil says you're allowed to put the incense on the coals in Yom Tov to lehariach, like the Tanna Kamar is a little bit tzaddik. Rabbanan hold it's aser because it has to be davar shel b'chol nefesh. Not every single person needs to have his hookah smelling up this whole house and giving this big, good, whatever Arabic smell all over. Not everyone needs that. I'm like, I'm there, but if you're doing it because you want to have your suit to have a certain smell, you walk into shul, you want everyone to look around and see who's this guy with this suit that has this aroma. That's going to be forbidden. That's not considered a hanas or guf. The whole machlekes was regarding this has to be davar shel b'chol nefesh. Now, similarly, the Gemara says, the following question: Ma'ala Hashem. What's halacha? Are you allowed to smoke up your fruits, where they would take the smoke of the summon, that the food should absorb the taste of the spices? You let us smoke it up on Yom. So the Yomir Abba Amarav, he says asr, says forbidden, because like the way Rashi says, it's like a certain, it's a tafnuk yiseir, it's like a certain delicacy, and that's not, again, it's not shabbat chol nefesh, it's only for an instance. And here, the smoking is ab malacha, like Rav Huna explains the reason of Rav, where because you're extinguishing the coals when you put on it the spices, the spice dust on it, you put the spices, so therefore that's going to be awesome. Shmuel says it's going to be permitted, and the reason for that is because it's eichel nefesh. And the truth is, it's fit even for poor people. It's just they don't have it. But if they had it, they would use it. And if it really is considered, which is along this bachlal and the whole svaras of eichel nefesh to consider davar shel b'chol nefesh, is it that it's not really everyone does it, or everyone would do it? It's just they don't have the opportunity. But as the Gemara explains, it says forbidden because you're extinguishing the clothes, like we explained before, when you put on the spices. And moreover, you don't have the heter to do this malacha on Yom Tov because it's not Shabbat B'chol Nefesh. Whereas Amalei Rav Nachman, he says, why are you saying the problem is because you're extinguishing? You should say because you're igniting the spices, which is also a malacha. Amalei says, yes, you're right. It's just that first what happens is when you put on the spices, the first thing that happens is it extinguishes. Only then does it ignite. And they're both there. And he says, I just picked the first thing, but the truth is, it has both problems. Again, you now do malacha on Yom Tov unless it's eichel nefesh. He doesn't consider eichel nefesh until it's davar shel b'chol nefesh. Now, Rabbi Yehuda, he qualifies, says, al gabi gechelas asur. He says, yes, so therefore on the coals itself is forbidden because that's where you have extinguishing and ignite. But as you continue to if you do it on top of an earthenware, which was heated up, then look, it's going to be permitted because, as Rashi explains, Taisa says differently, but Rashi says that you're not having any extinguishing because there's no coals there, it's a piece of earthenware. And regarding igniting the spices, Rashi says it's done in an indirect way, through a shinui, kalachayat, and there's no issue deraisa, and therefore then we didn't say that's going to be forbidden to be done on Yom Tov. Rabbi says, says, no, even on earthenware it's going to be forbidden. For a different halacha of what's called moilid, which is because you're actually giving a good smell from the spices into the earthenware, which had never had that smell before, which you're rabbinically forbidden because you're introducing what's called moilid, a new thing, which is very similar to like making a malacha, which is a rabbinic isser of moilid, and therefore it's going to be forbidden. And similarly, Rabbi and Rabbi Yisrael, they both said, to turn over a spice cup on top of the silk of the clothing, which is because you want to put a good smell into that's in the cup, into the clothing. But Yom Tov also, Yom Tov forbidden. Might have what's the reason? Because you're introducing an aroma into the clothing. Says the Gemara, but what's it different than we learned the Brisa elsewhere that says by the Atzi B'Samim, you're allowed to roll it between your fingers to get a good smell out of it, or you crush it where you're cutting it where it's moist, it gives a smell, where it's detached from the ground, to give a smell, you're allowed to do that on Yom Tov. Says because there you already have a smell in that B'Samim. You're just getting more out of it. You're introducing a whole new smell into something you never had before. That's a problem at Moilid, and therefore that you wouldn't be able to be doing on Yom Tov. That's the problem that you would have of, like we said, that's why Rabbi disagreed. And he says, no, even on Cheres you're not do, because even though you're not going to have the problem about Machab and Maver, you are going to have the problem by introducing a new smell into the earthenware, and therefore that would be forbidden on Yom Tov. Thank you to any time.